All right. So again, welcome to Abraham's Whiteboard. This is our program where we explore topics through the lens of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The purpose of Abraham's Whiteboard is to learn about the wide-ranging impact and diversity of religion around the world, making sure to understand them in the context of Judaism, Christianity, and/or Islam. And it has included a variety of topics throughout history and different religions as well. Our goals and guidelines for all of our programming is to be respectful as possible, to challenge your own assumptions, speak from your own point of view, and be open to a new perspective. Basically, we want to encourage people to be comfortable in discomfort if necessary, but be gracious to yourself and to others as needed. Laura has told me that she is open to questions during this topic of her speech, so feel free to jump off of mute and ask a question or type it in the chat, and I will get on there and can bring the topic forward. Just a few announcements of upcoming events. On May 8th, at noon, we have our regular monthly Women of Tri-Faith lunch, and that is virtual. So just register for that. On May 16th, we have our Making the Familiar Strange. Mindy Marburg from Temple Israel is going to talk about the Woman of Valor. We have Coffee on the Commons, which is another monthly event. It's the third Thursday of every month at 11:30 at the Tri-Faith Center. Come as you are, come as you can. It's just coffee and treats. And then on Sunday, May 21st, we have our Garden Awakening at the Tri-Faith Garden, and we will be having speakers and some musicians playing to sort of reawaken the garden for spring. And then in June, we have our Race, Religion, and Social Justice Conference. Our keynote speaker this year is Clint Smith, who is an author and a poet. He wrote the book, How the Word is Passed, and he has a new poetry book out. He's going to do the keynote event on Wednesday evening at Temple Israel. And then the rest of the conference will be on Thursday, June 8th. So you can go to our website, and there will be a drop-down menu that pops up to register for that, and you can register for the Clint Smith event separately if you don't want to attend the conference, but we hope you will do both. And our speaker today is Dr. Laura Alexander. She's an associate professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and she's the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights. So I will pass it to Laura, and as she said, feel free to ask questions as we go. So thank you so much. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for being here. And I'll go ahead and get started. I was telling Megan it's a longish talk. It's not probably longer than some of what we've had at Abraham's Whiteboard, but yeah, I would be happy to have folks either raise your hand through Zoom or put something in the chat or whatever works for you in order to be able to have some conversation throughout, and then we'll also be able to discuss at the end. The one other thing I'll say to you, Megan, is once I start sharing the screen, as you know, I can't see as well what's going on in the Zoom. So just give me a heads up somehow if I need to change something or technology's not working, whatever. But again, yeah, thanks everybody for coming. It's always nice to have a chance to speak with Tri-Faith folks. We over at Religious Studies at UNO have had longstanding partnership with Tri-Faith. And one thing I'm looking forward to in the fall is that my religion and human rights students are going to do a service learning project again in the fall with the Garden and Orchard Committee at TFI. So just a little shout out to that committee, and I'm looking forward to working with you all again soon. I also want to say thanks to Megan, thank you to Jeremy, and to all the Tri-Faith staff for your good work on this set of events and with Tri-Faith in general. So let me pull up my slides now. Okay, like I said, just let me know if anything goes wrong here. But as you can see from the title, and you can see probably when you signed up for the talk, my title is about race, religion, and borders. And the borders that I'm going to talk about are specifically national borders. So we'll look at the intersection of race and religion in relation to borders and global migration. Here are the main points that I want to make. First, there are two concepts that arose in the early modern period. So by that, I mean roughly around the 15th to the 17th centuries. And these two concepts are very important for understanding contemporary migration. The first of these concepts is the theoretical or conceptual division made by European colonizers where they put different groups of people into categories based on race and religion. And these categories that the colonizers put people into were enormously influential in exactly who was perceived in particular ways. So who was perceived as being properly religious? In this case, the colonizers were Christian, so properly Christian. Who were perceived as being able to fit in with Western societies, even who was considered to be civilized or governable. And these concepts or these categories also made a difference in Western ideas about who would be allowed to move freely through the world during this age of exploration, and whose movements were either restricted or forced. So the second of these important concepts that I'm talking about is the division of the world into nation states with full sovereignty and control over their borders, territory, and population. Certainly, territory was divided and controlled before this time, but the rise of the bounded nation state in this early modern period gives political authorities specific forms of control over people's movements. And that includes the ability to include or exclude people based on those racial and religious categories that I'm going to get more into. So that's kind of a first point with two parts to it. My second point is that these racial and religious categories from the early modern period continue to heavily influence policies related to migration and movement, and also then the application of those policies in many countries today. I'm going to focus on the United States because that's my primary research focus when I work on immigration issues. But many wealthier Western countries are impacted or influenced by these concepts, again, originating several centuries ago. And just to define my term there, when I use the word Western, I'm going to be referring either to European countries that colonized other countries during the early modern period, or countries that have inherited cultural norms and many of the same practices from those European countries. In addition to the United States, those would include Canada and Australia, and arguably Israel as well, although there are some historical and, of course, religious differences to consider there. So for the structure of this talk, I'm going to spend the first part fleshing out some of these historical claims. I'll spend about 15 minutes talking about the development of these religious and racial categories during the early modern period. Then about 10 minutes talking about the development of national borders and this strong idea of state sovereignty. Then I'll jump ahead in time and talk about immigration policies, again, especially in the United States, that reflect some of these categories. We'll spend about 15 minutes on that as well, and then wrap up and have conversation. So again, you all did indulge me by agreeing to come to a talk that's an hour and a half long, so you can hear about how long I expected to be here. But as Megan said, you can jump in with questions. And we'll also, of course, have some chat at the end. I would actually also like to start by having you all reflect on this topic briefly, just so it's not me all the time. It also gives you a chance to think a little bit about kind of your perspective on the topic before we really get started. So let me start there with my next slide. And of course, in this virtual format, there's a limit to how much we can interact with each other. But I just want to ask you all to think about a couple of questions for yourselves. You can just kind of simply reflect, or if you even want to write down a few notes, that's fine, before I launch into this story that I'm going to tell. And the questions for you are, how has your religious or racial identity impacted your experience with borders or your experience of borders? You can define borders in your own way here. And then next, how do you see national borders intersecting with religion and race? So I'm going to mute for about just a minute and let folks reflect on that. Again, if you wanted to put something in the chat, that would be fine. But this is mostly just for everybody to have a chance to do some reflection before I get into this historical part of the discussion. Okay, thank you, everyone. So now let me get started for good. And we're going to begin with two stories from the 16th century. In 1588, the up-and-coming Jesuit priest and scholar Pedro Paez Jaramillo received permission to travel from Portugal to Goa, which at the time was the capital of the Portuguese state of India. He enrolled in a theology course, but he didn't finish because in 1589, Jaramillo was selected to accompany an older priest on a mission to Ethiopia. As Isabella Boavida and co-authors stated, Jaramillo was, quote, hurriedly ordained a priest, unquote, and sent on his way. His journey did not go as planned in any shape or form. The ship that the priests were on sank, and they were rescued and immediately imprisoned by Turkish authorities. And then after a full 7 years, they were ransomed and returned to India. There, Jaramillo attempted to resume his theological studies. He fell ill for several months. He was appointed the administrator of several villages. And then in 1603, he again departed for Ethiopia. This time he was successful, having disguised himself as an Armenian merchant so that he could travel on a Turkish ship. Jaramillo's mission had its ups and downs, but it was ultimately unsuccessful. He was not really able to, he made it, as I said, he made it to Ethiopia, but he didn't really achieve the kind of mission work and the religious work that he was hoping to do. Now he's really best known for his history of Ethiopia that was written between about 1613 and 1622. Our other story, just a few years before Jaramillo first set out in 1581, another Jesuit, Alessandro Valignano, paid a visit to Oda Nobunaga, who ruled in Kyoto as the most powerful feudal lord in Japan. Valignano, who's making this visit, was a missionary. He was not as hastily ordained as Jaramillo, and Valignano oversaw Portuguese Jesuit missions in East Asia. On his visit to Kyoto, Valignano was accompanied by an African slave, Yasuke. Yasuke was probably not this man's original name, and his exact place of origin is unclear. He might have been from present-day Mozambique, South Sudan, or Ethiopia. Yasuke was kidnapped as a child and sold to Portuguese enslavers who took him to India. Eventually, he was enslaved by the Jesuits, and he was brought with Valignano's party to Japan. When the group arrived in Kyoto, the ruler, Oda Nobunaga, was so enthralled with Yasuke's black body that he ordered him to strip to the waist and scrub his skin in order to show that he wasn't covered with black ink. So this early modern period is a time of movement and exploration, but we can already see in these stories how movement between different political territories was very different depending on one's social position, nationality, and race. Jaramillo is Portuguese, European, white. His journeys are not easy, but he had some choice in where he went. The Portuguese, including their Jesuit missionaries, had expanded the reach of their power, so that enabled a certain freedom of movement for Portuguese traders, soldiers, and missionaries. It also entailed the ability to force other people to move. Yasuke's story begins with forced movement. He is subject to the force and the whims of others, and that uproots him and moves him around from place to place. Movement and migration are natural for human beings in many ways. Human history is a history of movement. We know that from archaeological research and from scriptures. Scriptures narrate people's movements over thousands of years for livelihood, religion, safety, and other reasons. Even in the case of many indigenous communities that have strong connections to specific lands, many communities do migrate regularly with the seasons, or for hunting purposes or tending herds. For example, the Blackfoot Nation in North America, or the Sami people of Finland, Russia, and other Arctic countries. So human migration is natural in certain ways, but the stories of Jaramillo and Yasuke show how the early modern period increased the pace and scope of human movement, while also forming a new set of power relationships where some people chose to move from their places of origin for their own purposes. Some people had their places of origin taken from them or rendered unrecognizable. And some people left their own place and moved elsewhere by force. So again, as these stories have suggested, the development of early modern categories of race influenced both human movement and power relationships between individuals and groups. I want to shout out here to Willie James Jennings and Jessica Wong, whose work examines the intersection of religion and race in early modern colonial thinking about migration, movement, and power. As Jennings notes, when European scholars and Christian missionaries entered new lands as part of the colonial project, they immediately began to categorize and even rank groups of people based on their perceived proximity to whiteness. Whiteness itself could be a slippery category, but it became a kind of yardstick, a way that colonizers measured and ranked both themselves and others. Usually, these ranking systems involved multiple categories. People whose identities were perceived as somehow being closer to whiteness were categorized by priests and scholars as more beautiful than others. But it wasn't just that. Jessica Wong has noted that European colonizers, and again, especially priests and missionaries, viewed themselves as imitating Christ. So they believed that they stood as the image of Christ, and therefore that they, the European colonizers, were the pinnacle of humanity. So there is a perceived fundamental connection between, to quote Wong, the white European Christian discipleship and human civilization, unquote. Colonizers believed that they were bringing not only Christianity, but civilization and good governance to people who did not have those things or had them only in part. In multiple reports from missionaries like Valignano, perceived whiteness or proximity to whiteness was associated again with beauty, intelligence, fitness for Christian conversion, fitness for Christian leadership, and fitness for what the colonizers considered civilization, all at the same time. Let me cite a few texts to make this more concrete. I will say that I've avoided some of the worst language here, but I need to apologize in advance that some of the language and descriptions here are quite shocking. I'm quoting this in order to be clear in some ways about just how shocking and pernicious this early modern racial stereotyping by European colonizers was. So here's a few. On his third voyage to the Americas, Christopher Columbus wrote an account to give to the Spanish monarchs. When he reached a particular area of the Americas, Columbus writes this, quote, "A large canoe came from the eastward, containing 24 men. They were all well-proportioned, and not dark black, but whiter than any other Indians that I had seen. Of very graceful gesture and handsome forms, wearing their hair long and straight, and cut in the Spanish style," unquote. Through his narration, while Columbus is talking about his interactions with this group of people, he continues to describe them as relatively white and being both tractable and beautiful. To go to another part of the world, Valignano's description of the people of Japan reads this way. So again, a quote, "These people are all white, courteous and highly civilized, so much so that they surpass all other known races of the world. They are naturally very intelligent," unquote. An earlier explorer, Garcia de Escalante Alvarado, described Japanese people as good-looking and white, with women, quote, "dressed in the same manner as the women of Castile," unquote. So in these cases, whiteness is associated with people who are somehow similar to the Spanish in their looks, hairstyle, or dress. And again, whiteness also gets associated with beauty and intelligence. On the other hand, we have a report from Gomes Yanes de Zurara, the court chronicler for Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal. And this report actually is back to 1444 about an early slave auction of human beings who had been kidnapped in Africa. So this is what Zurara writes, and again, a quote. "Amongst them were some white enough, fair to look upon, and well proportioned. Others were less white, like mulattoes. Others again were black as Ethiopians, and so ugly, both in features and in body, as almost to appear the images of a lower hemisphere, unquote. And one last quote from Valignano, again, and this is giving his interpretation of the people of Monomotapa in present-day Mozambique, so he's writing again from the mid-17th century. So this will close us out by showing how colonizers, including priests, often associated dark skin with irreligiosity and with a lack of intelligence and civilization. So Valignano says, again, a quote here, they, these folks from present-day Mozambique, they are a very untalented race, incapable of grasping our holy religion or practicing it. Because of their naturally low intelligence, they cannot rise above the level of the senses. They lack any culture and are given to savage ways and vices, and as a consequence, they live like brute beasts. In sum, they are a race born to serve, with no natural aptitude for governing. But through a just, though hidden judgment of God, they are left in that state of impotence and regarded as a sterile, reprobate land, which gives no hope of yielding fruit for a long time to come, unquote. So I think with that, that's probably sufficient and perhaps a little bit more than you would have liked. But I want to be clear about both the depth and the pervasiveness of early modern thinking about racial categories and how European colonizers sorted people into these categories, both based on appearance and place of origin, and then associated different categories with intelligence, beauty, religion, and fitness for political organization or governance. Now, I'm actually going to talk more about boundaries later than I do right now, but we can also notice that during this period, the boundaries between political communities tended to get drawn based on where the colonizing powers could hold territory or where they wanted to hold territory. Many of these colonial boundaries weren't fully solidified until the 19th century. For example, the Anglo-Italian Protocol of 1891 crafted the general shape of contemporary Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya by drawing borders between British-controlled and Italian-controlled territories in East Africa. But the roots of these sort of agreements began with parceling out colonial territory in the 15th century onward. We're thinking about place and boundaries, and going back to this question about sort of racial categories, Jennings, Willie James Jennings, makes a really intriguing argument about the relationship between this sort of colonial configuration of place and those racial categories that I just talked about. Jennings argues that there is an intersection during this period between colonial exploration in search of resources and power and certain elements of the Christian imagination that downplay the importance of place itself. So you've got, on the one hand, movement and exploration, and on the other hand, you actually have a kind of theological downplaying of the importance of people's place of origin. Jennings suggests that a strong emphasis on the idea of creation out of nothing pushes people to think of the earth and its people and places as being contingent. So then human beings are defined not by our place or the specifics of our community, but instead by our spiritual need for salvation in this way of thinking. I don't think Jennings is arguing that Christian texts or ideas have to be interpreted in ways that downplay place or creation, but he does suggest a distinction here from religious traditions, and particularly indigenous traditions, where people's identity is inextricably bound to specific places and geography, and to living in specific places and geography. Even if we do recognize that there's a certain naturalness to human movement, and even if religious traditions can certainly value both place and movement, Jennings is warning about the perils that come with dismissing the importance of place, and the perils that come with using violent power to devastate places and force people out of them. Jennings also argues that if place no longer marks one's identity, then some other category ends up being used. And in the case of the colonizers, these racial categories that we've talked about become those identity markers that divide people from each other. Anyway, let's keep these this question about kind of early colonial movements and race categories in mind, but table it for a moment to talk about borders. For this next part of the talk, I would like to examine a particular set of developments during the early modern period, where what's solidifying at this time is not only these racial categories, but actually the modern idea of state borders as well. So you have this kind of rapidly solidifying idea that there is a clear, distinct boundary between different political communities. And each political community has its own sovereign government that controls its territory and population. It's not that borders didn't exist before this, but borders and territory have been envisioned in different ways at different times. The specific idea of a bounded state with a centralized government and complete sovereignty over territory becomes prominent in the modern period. Many of you are familiar with the Peace of Westphalia, which was a series of treaties that brought an end to the religious wars of the mid-17th century. Westphalia is known for its principle that the ruler in each territory would declare and control religion in that territory. So that meant that a Catholic ruler could declare their country Catholic, a Lutheran ruler could declare their country Lutheran, and so on. This agreement set the stage for the contemporary conception of the sovereign nation state. In other words, each state, that is, each country, is equally sovereign, meaning that it determines its own activities within its borders. Furthermore, the government of each state fully controls its people and territory, including its borders, and who can move into or out of them. And as part of this agreement also, states are not to use military force against each other, except to defend their own territory or population. Now, again, control of territory and population is not exactly a new thing in the world, but we can think about how the development of strictly bounded states makes it very important for people to have clear legal status in a state where they can make a life. These clear and bounded states also incentivize governments to try to shape their populations to their liking. There are clear boundaries that determine whether you're in or out, and governments try to keep in the people that they want and keep out the people who they don't want. As state borders have hardened through the 19th and 20th centuries, policies, especially that keep people out, have also gotten stricter. And if we look at the content of immigration policies, we can see how those early modern assumptions about religion and race shape attitudes and laws in Western countries about who should be let in or kept out. Before we focus on the United States, let's look at how religion and race have shaped exclusion, again, even in that early modern period. The well-known expulsions of Muslims and Jews from 15th century Spain foreshadow this idea that the ruler gets to decide on the religion of a country, and that the ruler expels or converts people who don't share that religion. Some Muslims and Jews were also forcibly converted during the 15th century, but then over a century later, the Spanish monarchs also expelled many Moriscos, or descendants of forcibly converted Muslims. Mercedes Garcia Arenal and Gerard Wiegers write about this event, and they actually argue against interpreting this as an example of race-based thinking. They claim that when the Spanish monarchs expelled Moriscos, they viewed them as a religious community and not as a racial community. They say that race wasn't a category in use at that time. Now, again, at this point, we're talking about the 17th century, and given what we've already heard from Valignano and others that happened previous to these expulsions, I actually kind of doubt the certainty of those authors' claim that this was a religious and not a racial category. They claim Spaniards would not have been thinking in racial categories, but I think we've already seen how race and religion are tied together in the minds of European leaders, even in the 16th and 17th centuries. In any case, even so, Garcia Arenal and Uyghurs do make the point that Moriscos were thought to have the wrong lineage. So in the minds of Spanish authorities, these, again, descendants of forcibly converted Muslims, the Spanish authorities thought that they could not escape their heritage, whether that heritage was religious, racial, or both. Families that had been Catholic for generations were under suspicion of not really being properly religious or not properly Catholic. And so therefore they were under suspicion of not really being loyal to the country. And this was not because of any actions that those individuals had undertaken, but because of their lineage. The Spanish monarchs considered them unassimilable, not able to be assimilated, and therefore the government simply expelled them from the political community. Again, we can see how these religious and racial categories get viewed by colonizers as matters of lineage. Either you were born in a people that had the supposedly right characteristics, or you were not. You were born to be properly Christian or not, and you were born to be fit for governance or not. And then as sovereignty and national borders become more rigid in this later period, so thinking towards 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, Western governments become increasingly concerned with keeping out people who they thought, based on lineage, they thought these folks would be poor members of their communities. In the United States, it's fascinating to see how these categories were even applied to certain European groups. Some of you will know that Benjamin Franklin openly worried about the influence of German immigration. And that always amuses me personally because my family heritage is primarily German. So it always kind of like makes me giggle when I read this stuff. Even though, again, actually, it's when you hear these quotations, it's kind of shocking. I hadn't even read the direct quotations before working on this presentation, and I was kind of surprised, shall we say. So it is worth using Franklin's exact words because, again, they show just how deep this idea of heritage and even racial characteristics, even of different European groups, can go. So Franklin says in an essay, and this is a quote, "Why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements, and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them? And they will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion." Which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. Let me just say again, I'm quoting Franklin here. This is all a quote. So Franklin says the number of purely white people in the world is very small. All Africa is black or tawny. Asia chiefly tawny. America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who, with the English, make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I could wish their numbers were increased," unquote. One more, in a letter to Peter Collingwood, Franklin worries that German immigrants are not willing to be governed, especially by the religious authorities. Germany is not sending, so to speak, their best. But again, to quote, they are sending, quote, "the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation," unquote. Franklin especially worries that German immigrants and their children are not willing to learn English. And he says that they import books and write newspapers in German. It's really in the mid to late 19th century that the US government starts passing laws to exclude people from entering. So we talked about prejudice against immigrants, but now we're starting to talk about laws. In the mid to late 19th century, the US is creating border control mechanisms and a bureaucratic apparatus to keep unwanted people out based on new immigration laws. Some of the descendants of English immigrants, and even the descendants of those Germans that Franklin was so worried about, fought for an increased control of immigration in order to keep out Irish and Italian Catholic immigrants. As Jim McBride has noted, the anti-Catholic Know Nothing Party actually won 60 congressional seats in the election of 1854, and its members pledged not to appoint a Roman Catholic to any government position. McBride also demonstrates that many of the dehumanizing descriptions of Irish immigrants that could be found in anti-Catholic rhetoric of the time were extremely similar, or even really the same, as dehumanizing descriptions of Black Americans. The next incarnation of an anti-Catholic party in the late 19th century, called the American Protective Association, also had its members pledge to refuse to hire Catholics for any job or support any Catholic candidate for elected office. And of course, the late 19th century was also when exclusionary laws against Chinese immigrants came into force. Many of you will know about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which put a 10-year ban on any new Chinese laborers immigrating to the US. It's not quite as well known that a few years earlier, in 1875, the Page Act barred, quote, immigration for the purposes of prostitution, unquote. And it barred it specifically for Asian women coming into the US. Because immigration officials had full authority to decide who was being brought for the purposes of prosecution, this meant that Asian women, and particularly Chinese women, could easily be labeled as prostitutes, whether that was true or not, and banned from immigrating. When you combine this with racist stereotypes about sexuality and just a general kind of intent to keep out Chinese immigrants, Chinese women are effectively prohibited from entering the US in 1875. So 7 years before, the Chinese Exclusion Act excluded yet even more people, including male laborers. The Immigration Act of 1924 took this exclusion further by entirely banning all immigrants from Asia and setting strict quotas on any immigrants who were not from Northern and Western Europe. At the time, only people who were racially categorized as either white or Black were eligible to be naturalized as citizens. So the Naturalization Act of 1790 in the US had made naturalization available only to white folks. And the Naturalization Act of 1870 allowed for the naturalization of people of African descent, and that's because of the legacy of American slavery in the Civil War. So even if folks are able to immigrate, only people of African descent and white folks at this point can be naturalized. So one thing that this bill does is to say that if you can't be naturalized, you are not allowed to enter the country, which excludes whole groups of people by saying that you can never be naturalized, therefore you're not allowed to immigrate at all. In this 1924 act, the quota set for immigration from Africa was just 1,100 people per year. And that's compared to a quota of over 140,000 immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. The low quotas for Central and Southern European countries also had the impact of excluding most Jews from immigrating, since Jewish immigration to the US was mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe at the time. Assumptions about the so-called fitness of people for entry and for assimilation into white American society certainly did influence the development and passage of the 1924 Immigration Act. Albert Johnson, representative from Missouri and the main backer of the bill, at the very least palled around with eugenicists and anti-Semites. Leaders in the eugenics movement testified in favor of these restrictions in the bill. And there was a lot going on here, but if we think back to Jessica Wong's discussion of European colonizers' self-perception, we can see echoes of the idea that anyone who is not from these specific areas of Europe, basically North and West Europe, this idea that those people don't have the temperament and intelligence to assimilate. So as Wong writes, and again, let me quote here, she writes, according to this logic, the body discloses a person's fitness for inclusion within Christian society, which is to say, within so-called civilized society. For a person's body indicates her true spiritual, intellectual, and social nature. It discloses the orderliness or disorderliness of her character, and therefore how well she will be able to participate within civilized, Christian, white society, unquote. So again, here we're seeing how some immigrants were considered to be assimilable and therefore could be admitted, and others were not considered to be able to assimilate into a perceived certain type of society. So that's a lot of history, and it doesn't stop there, of course. I'll go a little faster here, but as you know, there have been developments in immigration policy since 1924. Specifically, the Act of 1965 removed those racial quotas that we were just talking about. And so that was really instrumental in opening up the US immigration system, at least somewhat, to people from all over the world. The Refugee Act of 1980 systematized US policy around refugees and asylum seekers. And then the most recent comprehensive update to immigration law was in 1996. And that immigration law increased penalties for immigration violations. It added resources for border policing. It increased requirements for immigrants in order not to be considered a public charge on the welfare system. And it also increased both requirements and barriers for people who were seeking asylum in the United States. If we look at debate over immigration within the last 30 years, so basically since that 1996 act, we can also see the persistence of this idea that certain people with certain heritage are assimilable, governable, helpful to have, while certain people are not. Now, this is fairly clear in the case of politicians like Donald Trump. The idea that Mexican immigrants are rapists and that Mexico, quote, isn't sending its best people has resonances with stereotypes about sexual violence committed by people of color. And weirdly also, this resonates with Benjamin Franklin's claim that it's the, quote, most ignorant and stupid sort of Germans, again, with their swarthy complexions, who threaten the society that the English have established. I'm sure that you also remember the shithole countries remark when Trump disparaged Haiti, El Salvador, and African countries, and asked why the US couldn't get more people from places like Norway. Back in the 90s, during the debate in California over Proposition 187, and that was a policy to restrict services to immigrants and require public employees to report suspected undocumented immigrants. While that policy was being debated, proponents of the policy circulated newspapers describing Latino immigrants as fouling communities with graffiti, creating stenches of urination and defecation, and selling drugs. Around that time, so again, we're still in the 90s, a white man who killed one teenager and wounded another after confronting them for spraying graffiti was released without charge. I guess I should say killed one Latino teenager and wounded another. Both of the people that he confronted were Latino teenagers. He was released without charge, and dozens of people offered money for his defense fund. He was eventually prosecuted, but on weapons charges. He was not prosecuted for either murder or attempted murder, and he was sentenced to 3 years of probation. Returning to the present day, many of you have also heard about the so-called Great Replacement theory, which is an idea pushed in some corners of the internet and the media that immigrants of color are coming to the US, or maybe even being brought in intentionally, to replace white folks and to fundamentally change American society. In September of 2022, a poll from the Public Religion Research Institute found that 30% of respondents somewhat or entirely agreed with the statement that, quote, immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background, unquote. And then finally, we've seen some fairly clear differences in treatment of different refugee groups. starting with the Trump administration attempting to favor Christian refugees over non-Christian refugees for entering to the United States. And then actually with the Biden administration allowing Ukrainian refugees who are primarily identified as white and Christian to bypass the almost impossible barriers to seeking asylum that had been established during COVID. So where nearly every other asylum seeker was kept out of the US and not allowed to make their claim, Ukrainian refugees were given an option for how to basically sort of jump the line and be able to actually make their asylum claims. And I want to say Ukrainian refugees absolutely deserve the chance to seek asylum in the United States. But my point is just that at the same time, refugees from Haiti, Cuba, and other parts of Latin America, as well as Africa and Asia, are being turned away and told that you can't apply for asylum at all, and that they needed to wait in Mexico or simply go home. And while we're talking about religion, I haven't even gotten into Trump's ban on travel from Muslim majority countries, or the way that Muslim immigrants have been perceived by some of our politicians, where again, there seems to be less fuss about Muslim immigrants from places like Bosnia, where immigrants are perceived to be white versus Muslim immigrants from other countries. Leave us. I am down to my last set of slides here, just to kind of let you all know how things are going. Let me just reiterate a couple of points. So one is that states have increasingly hardened their borders, and they use more and more heavy-handed tactics to keep out immigrants in general, especially immigrants who are considered to be undesirable. This rigidity of contemporary borders has roots in the early modern period, roughly from the 16th century on, and immigration policies have become especially strict from the 19th century onward. This coincides with historical events where there is a perception by European and Western authorities that some people are more advanced or superior to others. So again, as we said in the first part of the talk, the early colonizers set up a set of racial categories, where proximity to whiteness also meant proximity to supposedly proper Christianity, intelligence, good governance, and again, supposedly proper civilization. With those two developments happening in the same era, the question of who has the potential to be a good citizen, perceived good citizen in a Western country, gets filtered through both racial and religious categories. And then often race and religion are actually read together so that those categories collapse into each other. And whiteness ends up standing in for kind of a good religious identity among the other aspects that we talked about. Some of you might recognize this picture or similar picture to it. For religious people in the United States who are committed to racial equality and interreligious cooperation, I really think that the approach to dealing with this problem of racial and religious stereotyping is to continue what a lot of religious groups and advocates are doing. And that's things like holding dialogue with neighbors, finding ways to come together for mutual understanding and action, helping to introduce people to each other who are dissimilar from each other, so that more people have the opportunity to meet folks who aren't exactly like them and dispel stereotypes. Understanding these deep historical roots of racial and religious categories might help advocates to figure out how to approach particular policies. And really, even the ability to explain that new immigrant groups have pretty much always been under suspicion and have always ended up contributing positively to American society might help in some circumstances. Religious traditions all have teachings about hospitality and welcoming strangers. By emphasizing those teachings and love for all people, religious traditions contribute in important ways to dialogue about immigration. But in addition to that, I think it's helpful to keep two further ideas in mind about how religious traditions might be able to interpret and discuss immigration and borders. First, more than a lot of other ways of conceiving of what it means to be human, religious conceptions recognize that human beings are mobile and migratory by nature. Many religious traditions start with a story of migration. Both physical and spiritual migration are often important for a person's spiritual development in many religious teachings. So religious communities have a particular perspective on migration and borders because they view migration as natural, and they view borders as sometimes useful, but contingent. Boundaries between groups of people are helpful when they promote the good of the community and the people in it. But those boundaries aren't good in themselves, according to most religious traditions. And so religious people have a lot to say about how to think about movement and boundaries. The point is that to go back to this question of place, religious traditions can also influence dialogue by reminding us of how our place in the world shapes our identity and how place itself is valuable. It's important to remember that there are religious communities who need to be in a particular place to fulfill their spiritual obligations. Again, human movement is natural, and sometimes it's the least worst option for folks. But even if it can be appropriate to critique borders and how borders are protected, it can also be more than appropriate to try to support people in their specific places and advocate for the sacredness of place and space. As kind of an addendum to this, I'll also note that state sovereignty and territorial control can be very important for formerly colonized countries that still have to fight to determine their own destiny in many ways. So there is a place for this discussion about state sovereignty and control of one's own borders and territory. There's a lot of nuance in this topic. But I don't think that any of that nuance undermines the specific critique of the use of racial and religious categories to stereotype people who are seeking to enter a political community, coming for safety, subsistence, or family. So to wrap up here, I hope that a deeper understanding of this history of the modern period, that intersection between more rigid boundaries around countries and political communities, and how it intersects with dividing people by religious and racial categories, I hope that that helps us both to understand and to address head-on contemporary issues of race, religion, and borders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Sorry I had to run off and help my daughter with something, but
Yeah.
this was a really great talk. There are so many things that I know I'm going to make sure I share with my colleagues because we're doing our working on our religious equity seminar and talking about those intersections of race and religion. And I think that's just going to be a really great addition to that. So yeah, we take any questions anybody has. You could put them in the chat if you don't want to speak up, or just unmute yourself and ask away.
Laura, as I've been involved in more racial justice, and this is in particular to the United States and the racism towards Blacks. Well, this is all. First of all, Wong, how was that seen as following Christ by this, and that they were imitating Christ when, if they're referring to Jesus, he was Jewish and it was not white, was not the construct. And secondly, this whole concept of race, it seems like it goes back a lot further than I understood, because as I'm learning, race is a construct, a social construct, and not anything biological or scientific. I mean, it's a concept made up to I don't know, categorize people, so to speak. When did that start, and how is it that the colonizers got all the power?
Yeah, so I can say something about what Wong is arguing. And I think what she's saying, I'm going to put words in her mouth a little bit here because she's not saying this exactly. I thought that this idea that got from Willie Jennings as I was researching this, that the colonizers were kind of downplaying the importance of space. I thought that was quite interesting. And you might also say that there's a kind of downplaying of particular identities or kind of history. So probably most of the colonizers that we're talking about, I mean, if you ask them kind of where Jesus came from, they would have said Galilee or something, and they would have somehow acknowledged his Jewish roots. But I don't believe they really thought of Jesus as Jewish. Like I'm a little bit limited here because I'm doing a historical project in this particular instance, but I don't probably have that whole kind of historical scope. But I don't think they were likely to talk about the Jewish roots of Jesus. So what she is saying is that the colonizers are taking the command to go out and make disciples of all nations, which is in Matthew, I think, one of the Gospels. And they're saying people who go out and make Christian disciples are following Jesus' commands. And in fact, they are imitating Jesus, because Jesus went out and made disciples, and then Jesus told his disciples to go out. So this is a way of imitating Christ or imitating Jesus. So in their mind, whoever went out and did that was the one who was then the image of Christ and showed this kind of image to the world. So that's where that kind of connection, where the European, and Wong actually says particularly the European man, becomes the image of Christ and therefore the pinnacle of humankind. And so everybody else has to sort of form themselves to the image of the European man, at least in the minds of the colonizers, because they're the ones who are most closely connected to the image of Christ. So I think that's what she would say about this kind of, and that's, again, you know, she connects that to this idea that, oh, the Europeans are more civilized, they have better governance and so on. Yeah, you had asked about racial categories. I think that the categories that we often think of now do tend to arise in this kind of early modern period. It's you know, it's a sweep of history, right, from way back to now. So there's not kind of one moment when it's like people go from talking about ethnicity or language or whatever in a different way, and then suddenly now we have these categories that we use today. But you really can see in some of that history that I was talking about how this idea of people's skin color specifically, and this idea of sort of different races of people coming from different part of the world, how that really solidifies. And I didn't really know how to get into it. I didn't have time, but Jennings talks a little bit also about how at the time there were Muslim communities that were enslavers, so that there were enslavers within Muslim communities who also made comments about folks from different parts of Africa, and made comments that sounded in racial terms. So they weren't using the same categories as the European colonizers, but it was, again, often if folks were from a Middle Eastern country or a Middle Eastern region, they would talk about folks from that region being kind of beautiful. And then the dark-skinned African, often slaves, would be perceived as not so beautiful. And so this idea actually, it was, I would say it was probably ended up being more pernicious for the European colonizers and enslavers to be making these categories, because they ended up having so much power over different parts of the world. But it was a set of categories that was just kind of coming to the fore among people in power in the early modern period. Did I get pretty much what you were asking?
That whole concept of just race being a construct, and how it has created such divisiveness and such a caste system. It's just made up. And how
well,
can
I think
it
you
be
can see
unmade?
it with the way that they talk about people in Japan as white. And at some point, folks in the US or Europe or whatever no longer view Japanese people as white. They view them as Asian, or, you know, again, there's different categories kind of through time. So you can see how, like, these categories are constantly shifting.
Yeah, there's even a legal case where a man who I believe was Japanese in the US tried to argue, like, I should be classified as white because look at my skin, it's lighter than this guy's. He did not win, but yeah. And then there was another case that I believe the guy was from India. I'm not sure where he's from, but basically in the Caucasus region. So he tried to argue like, I am Caucasian, like I like literally am from the Caucasus. And they were like, nope, you're not white. So
yeah, I have also read about a case where a man from India, I think maybe was arguing that he was high caste and therefore that also played into it. But I also, I didn't read about that when I was preparing for this. And so my ability to narrate that case is limited.
Yep.
But it is really fascinating the way that people will kind of, I mean, we'll try to sort of claim this proximity to whiteness for, you know, because it can help them to stay in a place that they have immigrated to, or because it gives them certain types of advantages. Social advantages.
Yeah.
How were they determining that the people they were colonizing were not smart or not fit for governance?
In some sense, I think I would probably say they just said it, right? That they just decided, like, we want to be able to take these resources and rule this territory. So it makes it easier to do that if you say that the people here aren't ruling their territory properly, or they're not using it properly, or whatever. I don't know specifics of whether there were particular, you know, folks who came in as part of like a Spanish military force who would then actually say, well, people in Mozambique are doing this thing and people in Japan are doing another thing. But, you know, I think a lot of it just got read through those racial categories and was just kind of declared.
I wondered if it was
you probably
language.
know, you guys know as well as, I'm sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
I was just thinking, is it language? They don't speak the language, therefore they must be stupid or something like that.
Yeah, but again, if you look at the difference between how folks from parts of Africa were talked about and how folks from Japan were talked about, there's something more going on, even if language is also a factor. And again, just saying that some folks who are here are going to know as much about, you know, the details of the history as I do, but the way that European colonizers would describe Native American communities, often, oh, well, these folks don't have any civilization at all, or, you know, there's no governance structure here that we can see at all. So just, you know, different ways of kind of perceiving and categorizing what people were doing, often based on race, sometimes based on perceptions of, if folks didn't have a permanent settlement and didn't farm, right, then Europeans might claim that meant that folks were not enacting civilization or something like that.
Anyone else have any questions or comments?
I think the part for me, again, because I actually tend to study more present day stuff, it's always amazing when I look at kind of what I'm looking at in terms of immigration now and how just what we hear kind of from politicians or me or whatever, and then go back and look at some of these comments made by Spanish or Benjamin Franklin or whoever. And, you know, it's you have to do a little bit of work to make sure that you're not just saying thing A and thing B, they're exactly the same as each other, but still, it's just kind of astonishing sometimes the way that the language looks so similar.
Yeah. And I was thinking too, like Lori was saying at the beginning about having German ancestry and thinking how odd that is to hear some of that stuff. And I think on my mom's side of the family were Irish, and my understanding is the story is our branch of the McCartney family came over and we had been Catholic but converted to Protestantism. And I wonder how much how Irish people were not considered white for a long time, and then like would we have been white because we became Protestant? Would, you know, all of that. So
that's interesting. Mm-hmm.
There's a play at the Blue Barn now that I think it's called The Chinese Lady or Chinese Woman. And they talk about, she's on display and brought over here to demonstrate what the Chinese are like. And that it gets a little pedantic at times, but there's stuff there I hadn't really been aware of. Discrimination towards the Chinese. And you pointed out all those immigration things where we just lock down and don't let anybody in. So yeah, and that's the Chinese Exclusion Act was really the first kind of full-on immigration restriction.
But again, I think it's interesting that it was women first who were excluded. And, you know, again, didn't really go into this. I think there's a good argument to be made that the reasoning for excluding women was essentially because they didn't want people to get a foothold, that the authorities of the time did not want Chinese laborers remaining in the US and becoming part of US society for probably even their whole lifetime, let alone generations. So if you can essentially keep people from having families, I think the hope was that laborers would come and work and then go back to China.
All right, well, if we don't have anything else, Laura, thank you so much for your presentation. That was excellent. Bill gave a comment and he had to leave early, but he said it was an excellent presentation as well. We'll hopefully have this recording up tomorrow on our YouTube channel. So feel free to share the link with anybody who wasn't able to make it tonight. And I'll send it out, just a recap email tomorrow to everyone anyway, that'll have the link in it as well. So thank you all so much for coming and spending your evening with us, and we'll see you next time, whenever that may be. So
I agree.
so
Thanks. And thanks, Megan, for setting it up. I appreciate it.
you're very welcome. Thank you. See you all.